Why did the prophecy given by Elisha in 2 Kings 3:18 fail? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and there are two things to address here. First, yes, the prophecy in 2 Kings 3:18 did fail. Second, we'll talk about why that happened. Now, what is the prophecy in 2 Kings 3:18? It was that Adonai would deliver Moab into the hands of the Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition. Now, what was this coalition trying to do? It was trying to reestablish dominance over Moab after the nation of Moab threw off vassalage to the king of Israel. Prior to the rise of Mesha to the throne, Moab was paying a large annual tribute of sheep for their wool to Israel. This is what vassalage was. A larger nation dominated a smaller nation and said, you're going to give us money or goods, you're going to give us soldiers every year so that nothing happens to this nice country you got here. And that was a very common geopolitical relationship in ancient West Asia. In fact, we have a very similar example of the same kind of thing going on in 2 Kings 18 and 19, where Hezekiah was under vassalage to the Assyrian king Sennacherib, and he did the same thing that Moab does in 2 Kings 3. He says, I'm not paying you anymore. He throws off vassalage. And the Assyrian king Sennacherib does the exact same thing that the Israelite king does in 2 Kings 3, mounts an invasion. And the goal of such an invasion is multi-pronged. First, you want to reestablish dominance. You want to show that nation, as well as all the other nations around that are watching, who's boss. You want to return them to vassalage, to subjugation to you, to demonstrate what happens when someone tries to challenge your authority. Another goal is related to the invasion. Invasions are expensive. You need to recoup resources. This is what happens in 2 Kings 18 and 19. The Assyrian king shows up and says, pay me my money. And Hezekiah pays him his money. That recoups the investment of the invasion. Something similar would have gone on with the Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition invading Moab. They would have sought to recoup the costs of that invasion, and subjugating the nation would have been the way to do that. Now, the prophecy in 2 Kings 3:18 is a promise of success. I will deliver Moab into your hand. What that means is that you will take back over control. To have someone in your hand is to have control over them. This is a promise of success. In other words, they would be successful in reasserting dominance over Moab. Moab would return to vassalage to Israel. In both the cases of 2 Kings 3 and 2 Kings 18 and 19, the attempt to reestablish dominance failed. Sennacherib was unable to take Jerusalem and had to return home empty-handed. Judah was free. The same is true of 2 Kings 3. The Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition had to return home empty-handed. They didn't get any money, and Moab was free. We even have an inscription on the part of Mesha, the very king who threw off vassalage to Israel, boasting about the fact that they were able to get out from under vassalage to Israel. Moab became an independent nation once again. So the promise to deliver Moab into the hands of the coalition failed. That is not up for serious debate. If it had been successful, Moab would have been returned to vassalage. Just destroying all of the nation except for the capital city is not success, just like it was not success for Sennacherib, who did the exact same thing but had to leave without conquering Jerusalem, without restoring Judah's vassalage to the Assyrian Empire. The prophecy failed. Again, that's not up for serious debate. Now, why did it happen? Well, according to 2 Kings 3:27, it happened because the king offered his heir to the throne as a human sacrifice on the city wall. This is right as the coalition is going to take the capital city. And what happens immediately after the offering of the heir to the throne as a burnt offering? The text says there was great fury against Israel, and they got up and left. And it uses the same verbs that are used to describe Sennacherib's retreat from Jerusalem after the angel of the Lord destroyed 185,000 Assyrian troops. This is a retreat. This is not completion of the mission. This is not deciding we're done here. This is a retreat. Because of what? Great fury against Israel. Where on earth did this great fury come from? Well, great fury here is using the word ketzef, a noun that is used dozens of other times in the Hebrew Bible. And apart from two prose couplets from the Persian period that are unrelated to the narrative use of this noun in 2 Kings 3, it always refers to divine fury, specifically Adonai's fury. But here it makes no sense as Adonai's fury. There's no reason that the Moabite king offering his heir to the throne as a burnt offering on the city wall would anger Adonai. And so the majority of scholars agree what's going on here is that the sacrifice worked and that it catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, who did the same thing to the invading coalition that the angel of the Lord did to the invading Assyrians, drove them off. So the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh is what frustrated the invasion and what resulted in the failure of the prophecy that God would deliver Moab into the coalition's hands. And that intervention was catalyzed by the offering of the heir to the throne as a burnt offering on the city wall by the king of Moab. This is the only explanation that makes use of all available data and does not require ginning up imaginary scenarios that are not in evidence. Now, this is going to conflict with the dogmas of the overwhelming majority of people who come to this text and expect it to be inspired, inerrant, and univocal. They're not going to want to accept it, which is going to incentivize them to seek out alternative interpretations, which is going to require ginning up imaginary scenarios that are not in evidence so that they can skirt around the data and arrive at the predetermined conclusion that, one, the prophecy did not fail, and two, it certainly had nothing to do with the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh. Now, these arguments don't work. They always require you invent evidence that is not there. And the accusation is frequently made that the notion that the fury refers to Chemosh is an invention of evidence. And it's not. It is the only plausible explanation of why the king offering his son as a sacrifice on the city wall would result immediately in fury that ended the campaign of the invading army. There's no other plausible explanation for this. And again, any attempt to come up with alternative explanations requires making up things that are not in evidence. And this makes the best sense of how this story would have functioned literarily as well, because this story is trying to account for why Moab was able to get free from vassalage to Israel. And in explaining how that happened, they needed something that would make sense to their worldview and preserve their understanding of their own identity and their relationship to their own patron deity. In this time period, patron deities only had sovereignty over their own nations. Adonai's sovereignty ended at the borders of Israel. Adonai lost home court advantage when they entered into the nation of Moab. And this is a way to account for how Adonai could be defeated. It sucks, but it's an explanation that makes sense within their worldview. Moab's patron deity, Chemosh, had that home court advantage and was able to drive off the invaders. This is why Adonai is able to drive off Sennacherib when he invades as well. So this is a way for the authors to, in a slightly embarrassed way, say, well, they were able to get free because we lost home court advantage. Big deal. It's a literary excuse. And that is why it is rather terse and doesn't go into remotely as much detail as the authors go into in 2 Kings 18 and 19 when they're accounting for the ability of Adonai to drive off Sennacherib. So this makes sense within a pre-exilic literary context. This is the only explanation that makes sense of all the data that we find in the text and the consistent use of the noun ketzef in reference to divine fury in narrative accounts elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. This is the explanation that also makes sense of the practice of vassalage, the practice of punishing attempts to throw off vassalage. None of the other explanations make sense of all of this. All they do is protect the dogma that people bring to the text. It does not allow the text to describe a failed prophecy. It does not allow the text to describe Adonai's defeat by the god of another nation. But it is precisely that explanation that is the only one that makes sense of all of the available data and fits the context of the composition of this story and the time period into which it was proliferated. And that is why the prophecy in 2 Kings 3:18 failed. And the fit for this video has been the 8-bit Avengers.